Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday life. Today I want to read from a psalm, it's Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in an uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts up his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Come and see what the Lord has done, the desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. He says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Well, we've come to the end of our series on what makes a church a good church, and it's fair to say that many of the themes in this series have been stating the obvious, and today's theme is no different. In fact, it may be the most obvious theme of all, namely that a good church trusts God. I mean, by definition, a Christian is someone who trusts God. However, as with many things in the journey of faith, it's not as simple as that. It's one thing to affirm something theologically or to agree intellectually that something's true, and it's another thing entirely to actually live that truth in the reality of everyday life. The fact is that living out our trust in God is harder than we imagine it's going to be. I mean, it's easy enough to say that we trust God, especially when everything in our lives is going well, but it's more difficult to trust God in practice when things are not going well, at home, at work, or in the church even. The Reformers had a saying that when God commands us to trust him, he obligates himself to be proven trustworthy. But that's not like a, get out of jail free card. We may be trusting to God to get us out of a situation that God may have actually put us in as part of his refining process that makes us more like Christ. Moses spent 40 years living in the wilderness, learning there what he could never learn in the comfort of Pharaoh's palace in Egypt. So in some respects, to trust God is to take a risk, because we've no idea actually where that journey of trust will take us. And the Bible never shies away from telling us that trusting God might be a painful or costly experience. If the history of God's people tells us anything, it is that trusting God is not a peaceful journey into the sunlit uplands of spiritual ecstasy and joy where nothing bad ever happens and all our wishes come true. I think we have this idea that the journey of faith goes in a fairly straight line. We become Christians, we join a church, we learn more about being a Christian, we're given opportunities to serve God, we become more like Christ, then we die and we go to heaven. But in reality, our journey is much more like this, a squiggly line on a page like a Jackson Pollock painting. Sometimes when we say we trust God, it's actually more often the case that we trust our own judgment and actions instead of waiting on God. There's an old saying that God helps those who help themselves. It's not a biblical saying at all. In fact, the Bible contradicts it. Yet despite that, it's a saying that many ascribe to in practice, even heroes of the faith. Abram's described in the Bible as a righteous person, and God gave him the promise of a son. But decades later, Sarah was still barren and past the age of childbearing. So they decided to give God some help. Abram slept with Sarah's maid and she had a son. Result. But unfortunately, he was not the son of promise. And the fallout from their actions continues today. One of the struggles we encounter when trusting God is that he doesn't necessarily respond to our trust in the way that we think that he should, or according to the timetable that we have set. It turns out that trusting God is more complex than we make it out to be. Our theology, trust and faith may be tested when serious illness or calamity strikes, when the world is in chaos and all around us evil appears to have the upper hand. Even now, we're living through extraordinary times. President Trump is pursuing a radical America First policy that is upending the world order established at the end of World War II. And his tariffs are likely to upend the global economy. Many people in the UK thought that a change in government would finally bring the years of austerity to an end. But it's looking very much like the cost of living crisis has only just begun, and there may be tough times ahead. Furthermore, some of us are going through tough times right now. Some of us are facing illness or the uncertainty and anxiety of waiting for a diagnosis, waiting for treatment, all the while dealing with the everyday crises and struggles of life at work and within our families. It's hard to trust God when you've reached the end of your rope and there's still a long way to fall. No wonder the psalmists so often cry out, "How long, O Lord?" Perhaps for some of us it feels like we are going from one storm in our lives to another. In such times as these, it's natural for us to ask, well, where is God in all of this? Where is God in the turmoil of my life? Where is God in the storm that I'm facing? You wouldn't be the first to ask those questions. The psalmists certainly asked them. And Psalm 46 is an answer. The event behind this psalm is not specified, but many scholars think that 2 Chronicles 20 may form the background to it. King Jehoshaphat was told that there was a vast army on the way to wage war against him and his people. And Jehoshaphat's response to this overwhelming threat was to seek God. And so in front of the temple and all the people, he prayed for God's help. And he ended his prayer by saying to God, "We do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you." If we're wondering where God is when we need him, the first 3 verses of this psalm tell us that God is in the storm with us. The psalm begins with a confession of faith and confident trust in God, that he is a refuge and an ever-present help in trouble. And the Hebrew phrase there means something like a help that can be found when you need it. The psalmist's confession of confident trust in God is based on their past experience of God, and that leads to ongoing confidence for the future. But that confident trust in God is all the more remarkable when you consider the scenario that he describes. The earth giving way, mountains are falling into the sea, and the waters are roaring and surging. It's a picture of the reversal of creation, an uncreation, if you like, but one that challenges or casts doubt on God's control of the cosmos. The word fall in verse 2 properly means topple, but in a passive sense in Hebrew, the verb is often translated as be moved. In Psalm 93 verse 1, we are given the assurance that Yahweh reigns, and so the world shall not be moved. In Psalm 104 verse 5, we're told that Yahweh has set the earth on its foundations. It can never be moved. The fact that God has set them in place and they cannot be moved is an expression intended to convey God's supreme control over creation. And so the scenario imagined by the psalmist here is very much a kind of, well, what if? What if the mountains do topple? What if the waters do surge and roar? How would that affect the psalmist's trust in God? And the answer in Psalm 46 is that even when everything is crumbling and chaotic, so that even God doesn't appear to be in control, even then, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. We should note that by painting a worst-case scenario, the psalmist is affirming that God's people will go through times when it feels like their whole world is caving in. like mountains falling into the sea. Notice the word though in verse 2. Some Bibles translate it as even if, and that's the sense of the Hebrew word. What the psalmist is saying here is that even if God does not rescue him from the storm, nonetheless, he will continue to trust God. And Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego made a similar confession in Daniel 3:18 before being thrown into the furnace. Trusting God is not a matter of trusting God to keep us from the storm, or even to get us out of the storm. Rather, it is trusting him in the storm. And it's his trusting God in the storm that leads the psalmist to say that he will not fear even that worst case scenario. You might know the story of Daniel in the lion's den. I think it's safe to say that that would be a terrifying experience for anyone. Yet when you read the story in Daniel 6, you get the sense that Daniel is really quite calm throughout the whole ordeal. And we might wonder how Daniel can be so calm, but the reason for his calm is beautifully captured in a painting by Britton Riviere. For in it, Daniel is not looking at the lions, he's looking heavenward to God. His trust in God is the source of his calm. You know, it's human experience. We all go through storms, broken relationships, cancer, bereavement, and our own journey towards death. What the psalmist is telling us here is that God is with us in those storms, and no storm is greater than him, and no storm is greater than the promises he's made. For as Paul would later write, nothing can separate us from his love, neither death nor life, neither angels nor other heavenly rulers or powers, neither the present nor the future, neither the world above nor the world below. There is nothing in all creation that will ever be able to separate us from the love of God, which is ours through Christ Jesus our Lord. The first 3 verses tell us that when we are in the storm, God is with us in that storm. And verses 4 to 7 tell us that God is among his people forever. The psalmist presents a very different scene from the opening verses. From falling mountains and surging waters to a city with a river running through it. The city, of course, is Jerusalem. And so the placing of the river in the midst of it is very odd. Jerusalem never had a direct water source, certainly not a river running through it. And this was a major concern, especially during times of war and siege. So why does the psalmist picture one in the city? Well, interestingly, rivers feature at key moments in the Bible story. Genesis 2:10 tells us that there was a river flowing from the Garden of Eden. And it suggests that the abundance of Eden was expansive, and that even in a situation of the terror and turmoil suggested by the opening verses in our psalm, that even in those sort of situations, even in a fallen and broken world, we can still sense a glimpse, a hint of paradise. Then there's the final 2 chapters of Ezekiel. They speak about a city and a river running from the temple throughout the city and the land. And again, the image is one of abundance and all that is necessary for life. Ezekiel's prophecy closes with the words, "The name of the city from that time will be, the Lord is there." Then fast forward to Revelation 22 verses 1 to 5. It speaks of another city and another river flowing from the throne of God, and there will be no need of the light of the sun or the moon or a lamp, for the Lord will be its light, for he will be, it says, present with his people there. John 1:14 tells us that God came and lived among us in the person of Jesus. And in John 4, he meets a Samaritan woman at the well and he offers her living water, not still water from a well, but a spring of water that wells up, he says, to eternal life. We should notice that in the second section, there's no suggestion that the city of God will topple or fall. Quite the opposite, in fact. We are told that it will not fall. And the reason for its stability is made clear. It is because the presence of God is there, as it was in Eden, as it was in the city that Ezekiel and John saw. In Mark 4 and verses 37 to 38, the disciples learned one of the most important lessons of life, namely that we are unlikely to drown when Jesus is in the boat with us. It's the presence of God that we need. And when we have the presence of God, no storm, no terror, no turmoil can ultimately overwhelm us. However, in verse 5, the psalmist tells us that God will help the city at break of day. This Hebrew phrase is found only here and in Exodus 14 and 27. So the psalmist is probably drawing his reader's attention to that text, where God parted the waters of the Red Sea and the Israelites walked across, hotly pursued by the Egyptians. And then we read that when Moses held out his hand at the break of dawn, the waters returned to their place, destroying their pursuers. The Bible is full of morning deliverances. For example, 2 Kings 18 to 19 tells how God, at the turning of the morning, delivered Hezekiah and the city from the Assyrians. And of course, the greatest rescue in human history happened at the break of dawn. John 20 verse 1 says, early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, just at that moment of the dawn was breaking, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. As the psalmist writes, weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. And all of this suggests that whilst the city will not fall, nonetheless it will be assaulted. It is going to go through those terrors, those storms, that turmoil. But at the right time, God will rescue it. For to trust God is also to trust in his timing. So when we are wondering where God is in the turmoil and the storms that we face in life, the first section of the psalm tells us that he is with us in the storm. And the second section tells us that he is with us now in the storm and on into eternity. In answer to the question, where is God when we need him? Verses 8 to 11 tell us that God is at work in the world. When the psalmist says that God makes war cease, he's not suggesting that God is a skilled negotiator, that he has managed to broker a peace deal. Rather, as Dale Davis puts it, God brings peace by force when he decimates all the material of war. The desolations mentioned in verse 8 are listed in verse 9. He makes war stop, he shatters the bow, he snaps the spear, he burns the battle wagon. And verse 10, be still and know that I am God, is a very popular verse, but unfortunately it's what I call a Princess Bride verse. One of the most famous quotes from that movie is, you keep using that word, I do not think it means what you think it does. You see, we generally understand this text in something like the experience of Elijah in 1 Kings 19 and 12, which describes Elijah experiencing a mighty wind, an earthquake and a fire. But God does not speak in any of those dramatic events. Rather, he speaks in a still, small voice, in a gentle whisper. And we react to that, we respond to that by thinking, well, that's what we need. We need to be quiet and down, we need to be still. We need to be still, we need to be quiet so that we can hear God's voice whispering to us. Actually, the text is not spoken to God's people at all. It's spoken to the warring nations, and it carries the sense of a demand. It literally means cease and desist. Or as we might say, God is telling the nations to chuck it. As Davis notes, the nations are being commanded to stop their hostility to God and his people and to acknowledge his sovereignty and his kingship. Philippians 2, 9 to 11 would be a New Testament equivalent, for there Paul tells us that one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And so the psalm finishes with a repeated refrain. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. You know, we live in a broken and fallen world, and we're not shielded from the consequences of that fallenness. People get hurt, things get broken. In all our lives, there will be turmoil and storms and threats that we can't yet imagine. But God says through the psalmist that he is in the midst of the storm. He is with his people in the storm and to eternity. And he is at work in the world. He is the help that can be found when we need it. Therefore, with the psalmist, we can say that we will not fear. Thanks for listening.